Join us on our Discord, the Greater Mandala. For access, sign up to the Order of Fire's mailing list.
All right, this is Jack Donovan, and you're listening to or watching Pater, PH2T3R, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here with my co-host, C.B. Robertson, author of many fine books. And he also does a thing. I just shot him an ad for it on Instagram in the stories. He does a thing called Office Hours, where he can help you fight on the internet. Like I saw that was part of your pitch, and I laughed. I'm like, unlike myself, CB actually really likes to argue on the internet, and he's good at it, so he can help you win.
and by arguing and by winning, sometimes that means recognizing the strength of the other side, and the best kinds of arguments, and it's probably my greatest pleasure on the internet is being able to leave the other person walking away with a feeling of like, that was really fun and interesting. And they're usually surprised by that sensation. They're like, expecting just a dirty fight, and they walk away being like, like, I still think you're wrong, but I'll have to do more research or something. It's
yes.
Everyone walks away better, I think.
Yes. You're a kind of gentler man than I. I'm just mean-spirited old curmudgeon at this point. But anyway, obviously we are today's show is about Plato's Republic, Book 6, and there's a lot to unpack in this, especially where if it comes up, it comes up. I'm not really going to focus on it, but there are many dragons out today. It is a day for dragons. And I have not maybe posted about it or talked about it at all because that was the deal, that I wasn't going to fucking do that. And we're going to talk about dragons instead.
Yeah.
But when bad things happen. But and use the metaphor for what it's for. But anyway, so without going much further, Mr. Robertson, why don't you get us up to speed on where we are in the Republic?
Well, to segue from whatever dragons might be out in the world, this feels like an appropriate chapter because Socrates is admonishing at some points Glaucon and Adeimantus that the true philosopher is not focusing on details, but upon the true form. And so it's easy to get caught up in, we don't need to be disparaging and call them mere details, but it can be nice to have an oasis of perhaps higher things to bring your eyes to. And I think the Republic is a much better object of focus, at least for, give it 48 hours before you go too crazy commenting on current events and so forth. But where we left off, we concluded Book 5, and we sort of didn't mention this as much as we perhaps should have, but Socrates gives an account of what the true philosopher is, as opposed to not a real philosopher. And the true philosopher, what he left us with was the form of what in philosophy is called essentialism. What is the essence of a thing rather than the details? And the true philosopher focuses on things that are eternal rather than the many, rather than the transient, distinct, not many beauties, but objective beauty itself, the form of the beauty. And so this Book 6 is where we transition, sort of fall true to form, from the details of the city, the particulars of the city, to the sort of the generalities by means of this idea of the philosopher-king. And there's probably two things that most people know about the Republic who haven't read the Republic. One is the Allegory of the Cave. Two is the idea of philosopher-kings. Book 6 is kind of the philosopher-king chapter. And at one point, Socrates, in talking about, we have to talk about how we're going to educate these people. How are we going to educate these philosophers? There can't be very many of them because they have to have all of these different virtues and qualities that often come, in opposition to each other. So he says, the very resilient, stalwart man who we want in a good warrior, is likely to also be kind of stubborn when it comes to ideas. He's not very likely to adapt himself that way. But conversely, the guy who is adaptive with ideas might not make a very good. He might not love his country and defend it in a solid manner. So he has to be this combination of seemingly opposite traits, and he has to be educated properly. I think one of the most interesting arguments he makes, speaking to Glaucon and Adimantus, is that um, you know in order to become a philosopher, someone has to be a great spirit, but without the proper education, these great spirits are also the greatest potential good, but also the greatest potential harm. They are not educated properly, and it feels almost like a little dig at Thrasymachus, and perhaps Gorgias and Callicles and the other sophists who are sort of pseudo philosophers in the eyes of Plato and Socrates. They're teaching philosophical skills, but not towards proper philosophical ends, and so they're doing great harm to the city. So it's implied. But I think my favorite line, though, in the book, and it's not specific to book 6, but this book 6 is where we hear it, is where I believe it was Glaucon. Is it Glaucon? I don't know. I don't remember. One of the boys interjects and says, "Yes, Socrates, all this sounds very good. This is very, very compelling stuff, but I can't help but feel like with each step you're leading us like slightly further away, and we end up at the conclusion with all of reality completely inverted. And no one can answer you, but this all feels backwards. This feels wrong, and it's not because you're necessarily right, but maybe it's because none of us have the skill to ask the right questions to take your argument." And that's one of those lines, one of those points that I think is crucial to remember, because it's in book 6 that I think I tried to sort of foreshadow this in the end of book 5. It's like we're reaching that inflection point where it becomes really easy to lose sight of the of the context. I don't know if anyone listening to here has done like Java coding, but with Java coding, at least back in the late 90s when I was introduced to it, there's these rows of parentheses, and you might have like 6 or 7 layers of parentheses within parentheses, all these strings of code between them. And if you miss that one parenthesis at the end, all the code doesn't work. It fails. And so it feels like in book 6 we're in a parenthesis within a parenthesis within a parenthesis. It becomes really easy mentally to forget one of those brackets. It's like, are we still talking about justice of the individual and constructing it a city in order to find what it is, or are we talking about something else now? And if so, when did that change happen? Because there are some interesting lines where Socrates will speak about how this city is difficult but not impossible to achieve. He's talking about it in a tone that suddenly sounds like it could be practical advocacy for this social structure in a real city. Almost, book 6 begins to have a little bit of that tone, even after book 5, where it was reestablished yet again that this is about finding justice in the individual, so that we can figure out what it is, and decide whether it's better to be just or unjust. So there's a lot going on, talking about philosophers and the philosopher-king, and what constitutes true knowledge versus mere opinion. If there was one theme, I would say, of this book, it's what is the difference between knowledge and opinion. And again, the ironies are so thick and beautifully it's hard not to laugh and think about it, intertwined, because Socrates has been he's been goaded by the party to go on and describe this. And again, he does this thing where he says, "Oh, I don't know if I want to explain this. I might lead you astray. I don't even know what I'm talking about. It would be horribly, dangerous and irresponsible for me to explain things that I don't know myself, that I'm just thinking through. And they basically say, well, he asks, it wouldn't be right to say what I don't know. And they say, well, no, it wouldn't be right to say that with certainty. But surely you can give your opinion on the matter if we're asking you directly, provided you aren't asserting it with certainty. That begins this conversation on opinion versus knowledge, and how basically opinion is always bad in Socrates' view, or in the view it would be required to be thought bad for rulers in this state. Again, the line is kind of blurry, and this is why it is so. I think Michael Segru is kind of correct that you haven't really read the Republic once until you've read it like 3 times, but you can kind of cut through that if you occasionally jump back to books 1 and 2 and remind yourself of the arguments and remind yourself of the structure of this whole work of art of a dialogue, for lack of a better phrase, and keep track, because every book is providing you with forms of argument, and they all relate to assertions that happen in previous points and later points. And there are lines that sort of are cues to remember those things. And one of the earlier ones, of course, in book 2 is where Socrates says, wow, there's nothing, it's truly divine to see people be able to steel man a position they don't hold, essentially, to be able to defend a position so forcefully without themselves being convinced by it. And one wonders if perhaps Socrates is doing that. But we get another one of those in book 6, where, and again, I can't remember which interlocutor says it, but Socrates asks at one point, do you remember what we were saying earlier about this or that subject? And the person says, if I didn't remember, then I wouldn't be worthy of participating in this conversation. And so it sort of implies the importance of remembering all the details of what has been gone over thus far, keeping track of the axioms and the assumptions and the conclusions that have been reached up to this point, what their context was. And indeed, good memory is one of the important qualities of a philosopher-king that he describes. He says they have funny descriptions of people who forget things as quickly as they hear them. And that, of course, can't be a philosopher-king. Again, it feels like not just a good virtue to have, but perhaps an essential quality to simply work through the book, which is one of the things that makes this book so hard to work through. The first time I read through this chapter, listened to it, I was actually listening to the audio version, and I was driving for some of it, and I was doing some electrical work for some of it. And I got to the end of it, and I'm like, I have to go back and re-listen to all of that, because it gets very technical and it gets very complicated. But anyways, the what we're basically talking about is the idea of philosopher kings, the importance of putting the philosopher in charge of the city, whether that's metaphorical or literal, and we conclude book 6 with this very interesting breakdown of kinds of knowledge, and there's a hierarchy with reason at the top, knowledge or wisdom second, belief or faith, as some translations say it, third, which is just conviction, and fourth is opinion as the lowest. And opinion they talk about in terms of basically just sense data, basically just what you observe in the world, but there's no axiom, there's no structure to your knowledge related to it. It's just pure sensation, essentially. And this they thought of as something very low and very untrustworthy. So it feels like a foreshadowing of Immanuel Kant in some ways, 2 millennia later. But that's the conclusion. I guess we can work back. So those are sort of the themes, but we have some very good illustrations. 2 in particular, the ship captain metaphor, and I particularly liked the metaphor of the. It was a very brief mention, but the man who has the philosophical nature, the way that the philosophical nature can go astray without proper education. And one of the depictions is of the man who recognizes the harm that is done by following the masses, but doesn't believe he can be of any use to society. So he becomes a private man and just withdraws. I thought their depiction of him, perceiving a storm, or was it like a blizzard, and just basically taking shelter, trying to protect himself, was rather vivid, even though it was a short one. But what were your thoughts and impressions of book 6?
Well, yeah, what really stuck for me, obviously, the ship captain thing is what I looked at this morning when I had to make the graphic for the show.
It's a great metaphor.
Yeah. It's great, and obviously, there's a lesson in that idea in the sense that nothing's really changed.
Yes.
The fact that because they talk about it in contemporary sense, like the people in charge right now. I've basically they're just basically like pirates who've taken control of the ship.
Should we explain the metaphor real quick for people?
Sure. Yeah.
So, you'll have to correct my memory if I'm remembering wrong. But basically, Socrates has just been challenged because Adeimantus had said, it feels like you've led us astray at every step, and now we're backwards because you're talking about philosopher kings, but when we look at philosophers, they don't do anything good for society at all. Right. They're completely non-functional. So what are you talking about with having like philosopher kings? And
yeah, he said they were basically like either like kind of
stargazers,
or they're just mean, or they become mean. Yeah, like angry. Which that's not wrong.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And so Socrates says, you'll have to forgive me for speaking in like parable metaphor, but like imagine basically the crew of a ship but the captain of this ship is like blind and not that smart and not that good at navigating. And so like everybody is like trying to fight for control of the ship, and everyone is fighting for control of the ship so that they can raid the locker, raid its contents, and distribute the alcohol and the food and everything among each other. And so it becomes this kind of like the grossest form of democracy on this ship, basically. And you get the sense, well, if one of them gets in charge, they're never going to get where they're trying to go, because it's not even like on their mind. They're thinking too short term for that. Right. And so he says, if the interest of the ship as a whole were concerned, they would go to the man who is most skillful in vision and in understanding navigation, obviously. But such a man wouldn't get anywhere by trying to like demand that they follow him. The ship would have to go to him voluntarily and demand that he be their captain, perhaps even against his will.
Which goes back to, didn't we have that discussion in one of the earlier books?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
As far as they would have to actually harass the leader to become the leader.
That was in book 1, if I remember correctly. It was the tail end of the argument with Thrasymachus, where he says, no, the leaders are enjoined to rule by threat. And the audience was like,
and that's why you have to pay them. Yeah.
So it was very, very. There's those kinds of callbacks are so persistent, and you find more of them every time you go back through. So it's a joy to see those little connections popping up again and again. But they cut both ways. Sometimes the connections are like, oh, that thing he said before disproves this thing now, and so or vice versa. Sometimes things that come up later disprove points made earlier. So. Or maybe not disprove, offer alternative arguments at least.
Yeah.
So
and that's kind of our noble argument about what I think most men feel that way. I mean, it's almost a trope in movies that most men feel that the reluctant leader. Yeah, exactly. Like he doesn't covet power. I mean, it's the Washington Cincinnatus thing. Like he doesn't covet power. But they have to pull him out of wherever he is because he's the only one that they trust to do it.
Right.
And that is, I think, almost a universal in like decent men, that they would prefer, if we had to talk about who we would like to lead and who should lead the most. I think that's something that most men could agree on. That guy who doesn't want the power, but is fair and makes good choices. That's the guy who we want actually to lead. But then the reality is that what's
it never
happening
works that
on that
way.
ship, what's happening on ship, it's so rare that we have to pick up rare examples from history that it happens.
Yeah.
But normally that's not what happens, and it's more like the actual ship that he's describing is that everybody's just rating the booze and like whatever. Like that's kind of what happens more often than not.
Yeah. What was I want to say the Fifth Crusade? There was some crusade. No, it wasn't the fifth. Maybe it was the sixth. There was some crusade where the knights of Europe basically were going to capture the Holy Land, and but they stop in Italy and they realized not only did they not have ships, they didn't have enough money to even buy ships. So they speak with some Italian lord who basically says, "I'll give you ships, but you have to do some of my chores first." And so they the Crusaders go and they raid other like Christian city-states for this Italian lord. And then I think they sack Byzantium, and then they just go home. They never made it to the Holy Land. And I feel like what Plato is setting up in this allegory of the ship captain and the crew, it's reminiscent of that ill-fated crusade. One of the silliest misadventures of that time.
There are a lot of silly. I mean, there's also the weird Child's Crusade. There are a lot of weird crusades. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know the story of that. I know a lot of weird like neofolk goth people who were always like going on about that. But they love to get into that. But because it's dark, it's gothy.
It's funny.
yeah.
In a very dark way, but like
yeah. But where this went for me though, it sent me in a little rabbit hole because I wanted to get my just perception straight about sophistry. Because I mean he brings that up a lot, and it seems relevant that he keeps bringing this up. And that's obviously like a beef, like a philosopher's beef from the time, from the context, if you look it up and read about it. And what I found interesting is that like a lot of the sophist work didn't survive. So we only have like the one-sided Plato being like, here's another problem with fucking sophists, But what he's describing has become the meaning of that to a certain extent, and it has a lot of practical modern applications. If we actually look what they're talking about as sophistry as being telling young men what they need to hear to become successful and the beliefs that they need to have, then I'm like, oh, that almost sounds like you're producing a Patrick Bateman speech where you're, we have harder problems than Sri Lanka to deal with. We have to end apartheid for one. Like all the things that, but no, seriously, I think it's an interesting topic in terms of like, if you're teaching young men the way that they need to argue to become successful is different than teaching them the way that they need to argue to find truth.
Yeah. I mean, Andrew Tate comes to mind because he sort of kind of I don't think he passed himself off as a philosopher. He says some philosophical things, but what he's trying to do is mindsets. He's conveying words and sentences impregnated with mindsets. They'll say, this will make you successful. And it's hard not to see if you understand the job of the sophist, which is basically educators for the wealthy young men of their society and how to be lawyers and politicians and to defend themselves in court and to make a name for themselves through the use of language. That's essentially what they're doing, Tony Robbins, Wayne Dyer, like all these guys kind of
like Half My Feet, Alex Hormozy, like all these people, all the
Deepak
people who are
Chopra.
doing, yeah, all the people who are doing success mindset. This is what
The
you need,
Secret.
and like yeah, but like sales mindset and whatever. I mean, so much of sales is like how to actually be a sociopath and make it work, you know. And the entire, whether it's good or evil, pretty much depends on what product you're selling. You know, like, because there's some things, like we have lots of friends who sell exercise really hard. And you can't really be mad at that because like you're just selling exercise and like it's good for people. But then that, you know, you can also use that power for evil, and you can sell them, you know, well, all the, you know, the bad exercise things like the weight loss cures that don't work and all the other things that are just ridiculousness.
And perhaps there's something distasteful in the form itself. I won't belabor the point with stoicism, but
because that's a good one. That's the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, okay.
Who is the best? Who says they're a stoic, but maybe is just a sophist?
Yeah, right.
Right. You know what I'm talking. I mean, obviously, I can't get the name right now, but
it's Ryan Holiday.
What is it? Yeah, Ryan Holiday. I mean, because he's creating an information product to make himself successful. Yeah. And he's selling philosophy, but it's not really about finding truth. It's about making him successful.
Yeah, it's just a jumble of amalgamated quotes from a variety of sources jammed together in a way that makes you feel as if you're being inspired and educated and maybe even turned into a philosopher. But there's no actual coherence. There's no worldview. There's nothing about like the logos, at least not in the 2.5 books I read from him. Going through there, it's not serious work. You'd be far better off just reading Seneca or Epictetus.
So, but I think that's why I think this sophism discussion, I think, is so important for young men and just men generally, because we live in an environment that's like
much like ancient Athens.
Yeah. I mean, sophistry. I mean, possibly even more so because we're getting it in reels in 15 seconds, like all day long. All this is sophistry. And I wondered, I think it would be an interesting quote to say in the same vein of thought as that. I think it's a movie that's called "Killing Me Softly," where Brad Pitt says America isn't a society; it's a business. Now,
that's a great clip.
Yeah, I brought it up the other day in our firearms group in the First Amendment. But because they were talking about some other political stuff, and I was being a little doomy about things, and but the idea, I'm like, could it be said that sophistry is the true philosophy of America? Because in the sense of that is we are more of an economic phenomenon than a philosophic phenomenon. As most of the nation, and that's true of almost every nation in a real way. But I think more the American dream mindset of like, you get out there and you do it, and you're going to make some money and make it like that. This is Americans are more that way than other people. Like if you talk to Europeans, they're not as much as like let's make money at all costs and be successful at all costs. You know. So
you mentioned early at the very beginning the office hours thing. Someone had asked me last year, like a year ago, about the relationship between Christianity and civilization, because Jordan Peterson had said something silly about that, and so I was like, is Christianity necessary for civilization? Well, no. China. Asterisk. Yeah. Egypt, freaking like pick your historical option, but like there's an asterisk there because all civilizations require a civilizational formula, which I cribbed from the Italian political school, talking about political formulas, which are stories that justify the legitimacy of power. And with a civilizational formula, you basically have a story that quells the blood feud. And the thing is, all these stories, whether it's like the American dream or whatever civilizational formula you might have elsewhere in Europe or Africa or Latin America or wherever, all of those narratives, all of those stories can be picked apart by the truth. And the American dream, if it is taken as an assertion of fact, rather than an aspired for ideal, well, then of course it's fiction, and that brings us back to our the metaphor we were introduced to in previous chapter of like, just because a statue is not found to exist in real life anywhere in the world does not mean the artist has therefore failed in construction of this beautiful work of sculpture. And I think that the American dream can feel a lot like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm not there's probably two different American dreams that we're talking about to a certain extent. I mean, as far as like the American experiment politically, that's one thing. And then there's, there's whatever 2.5 kids in a white picket fence version of the American dream and a television in every house. But I mean, there's things like that. And then, I was just talking specifically as far as our operational like ethos. As a people, I think Americans are very and that's what immigrants come here for to a certain extent. Like, I'm going to come to America and make a success of myself, and like I want to get in the success mindset. It's just it seems very predisposed to like the sophistry idea, and to take it one step further, if we want to be super devil's advocate about it to a certain extent. Isn't that what the university system actually is? Now, in terms of you go to the university system to learn the correct views that will make you more successful in society. That's really what's happening. If you go and you learn the DEI stuff and you learn to say the words.
We're here to make an impact, bring positive change to the world.
Yeah.
Make an impact is a key phrase.
Right.
I guess I had always thought of that as like the gateway to the American aristocracy. I hadn't thought of it as the gateway to the middle class or success, but there's some crossover there. There's something like that going on. There's a book.
Like these are the civilized views, and if you learn the civilized views and say the words, then you're going to do okay. You're going to get the house and whatever. You're going to get the $800,000 house and whatever, and have if you say the right words. But if you don't say the right words, you cannot have those things. And I mean that very much is similar to like because we're both on the same page as far as the it being a cult thing, the woke cult. So I mean, it's very much the same as like you go to church and you learn how to say when it's time to say Jesus, and then you don't end up getting burned at the stake.
You can't be, and you can't up until probably 2 decades ago. You couldn't be in politics unless you said a few positive things about Jesus in the Bible.
Oh, for sure, and it's still you're probably not going to do very well. I mean, I think
depending on where you are.
I think it's
either Jesus or climate change. Pick your poison.
Well, exactly. Like it depends what party you're going to be, but you have to say climate change, whether you believe it or not. You just say it. Just say
diversity.
It's real. It's real, and the same thing with like the Jesus thing. Like I mean, I think that Vivek probably would have made. It's hard. It's going to be hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around a pagan. And he's a pagan.
Yeah, like he says a lot of things about God in the singular, very, very pointedly.
His script was written well because he can say God, but he means like the all-encompassing thing of Brahma or whatever. We had one of the Hindu guys explain it to me. Ed explained it, I think, like what he actually probably believes. And how that interfaces with God and how he's using them like interchangeably.
Yeah.
But I mean, the same thing. Americans, I mean, they know he's not talking about the exact same thing that they are. And as I was told in our comments on the Agni video, the reel in Instagram, we definitely I deleted it, but we gotta like all other gods aside from Jesus are demons. Like just because I said about Agni and what it is, like just so you know, all other gods are demons, and so we got some of those in the comments, and that's what most of those people actually believe. So.
If anyone who is like watching this is a Christian, and you might be inclined to say that, you you're making your religion look really bad, really lame.
Yeah.
By the way, pagans
like
who do that to Christians also don't make yourself look very great.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, well, it's like, I got an interesting other comment that we got, and we'll get back to Plato in a minute. But another interesting comment that we got was a Hindu who was mad at me for calling Agni a myth.
And not the same sense.
And so she was mad because she's like, I bet you wouldn't do that to any other religion, and I was like, I will absolutely do it to all of them. Including the ones we like. Au contraire, I will do it to all of them. They're all myths, but
and that's not even a criticism. It's a compliment. A myth is higher than mere story or something.
It's just, I mean, it's just, we're just talking, and I think to me it feels like grown up terms, but I guess a lot of that's maybe like degrading, in a way. I'm not, but I mean, I feel like if you can't acknowledge that 1 billion people are not worshiping demons, come on, like it makes you sound so provincial, and it makes you sound like a hick, even though you could live in a big city and worship at a big church, but it makes you sound like a hick, you don't see the rest of the world, do you? It's not, and the same thing. What you were talking about, the thing about is Christianity never necessary for civilization? History says no.
China is still bigger than the United States.
Yep. Yeah, and we just talked about India.
For a long time.
More people.
India. Ton of people. Yeah. But the sophistry versus philosophy thing is interesting because and here we're sort of stepping out of the Republic and maybe into Gorgias. If you follow the line of like success mindset, and speaking of America has its own unique philosophy. It's called pragmatism. It's made by Charles Sanders Peirce, and is very popular with who are the other guys? John Dewey and William James. And pragmatism, there's basically two main schools of thought in terms of what is truth, what is true. There's coherence theory, which we're beginning to get with Plato, and there's correspondence theory, which is philosophically unsatisfying to purists because you can never be 100% sure. So like scientists who are constantly running empirical experiments are tacitly following a correspondence theory of truth. Truth is what corresponds to the external world. Coherence theory of truth is, what is internally consistent with a given set of known axioms. It doesn't actually have to touch the external world at all to be true. And we're beginning to get that with the forms here. But pragmatists, American pragmatists, introduced a third option, which is basically, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically, truth is what works. Truth is what predicts. Truth is it's not what corresponds to the real world, or it's truth is what produces better outcomes in a kind of a subjective way. And you see some of that laid out in Gorgias, where Socrates has this back and forth about is anything true, actually. But there's a sense of it here with the crew of the ship fighting over the spoils of the hull. And if you have someone who doesn't have their mind sort of on the good of the whole in the broadest sense of the identity of the entity in question, whether that's a ship or a city or an individual person in the whole of their body and their life, which again is the bracket context of this whole discussion, then you're going to be facing perhaps diminishing time horizons, shorter and shorter time horizons with the different parts of your body or the different crew members of the ship competing for control, competing for power. And so there's a question of, does sophistry inevitably lead to that? Is it if you are become divorced from what is objective or outside? Is it a kind of race to the bottom? And does that end at the individual level with perhaps addiction, where those little dopamine hits just outcompete everything else?
Well, I mean, if it's not guided by any holistic view of whatever you're talking about, you're seeing that now with AI. I mean, the race to like AI, well, we're not doing it with any holistic view to what's good for society. We are literally doing it to see who can do it first.
Yeah.
And just outpacing each other. And that's a really good example probably of the one side that's pure sophistry of like it'll work out fine, but we're doing it. Is what they're doing. Like, who cares? Whatever. We're just making it happen, and someone's going to make a lot of money. And then the other, yes.
Oh no, go ahead.
And obviously, then you have the other side that's like, well, what we should talk about what's good for society, but you bring up pragmatism. I mean, I've looked into that before because it just sounds obviously naturally that something's going to appeal to me because I'm so cussedly American.
It appeals to me a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me like what works, like what's actually, because it gets at the truth to a certain extent.
The truth.
You can get it in it's always. You can get it you can be in a really cynical sense. I brought up today, I think in the Discord group, I threw out, there's that famous quote from Otto von Bismarck, that politics is the art of the possible. Mm-hmm. And like that's been repeated. I think you remember it being in it's a part of the song in Evita or something.
Well,
like that.
it's a theme in our book too. Is this city even possible? Socrates is now claiming in book 5, he was saying, let's, of course this is probably not possible. But now here about philosopher-kings, he's saying, I am not willing to assert that it isn't possible, which it's hard to tell if he's backtracking or not. Yeah. On the possibility of this city.
Well, and the non, the art of the possible is very obviously cynical in approach, but then the other side of that is like, well, a little bit more what we reach for when we talk about wisdom. Well, how do things normally work out? Like how do things, like, if you look at what is the best outcome based on, like I always talk about best practices. Like what's probably the best practice for that based on what we've seen over and over and over and over and over again. Right. Truth in the abstract and all these things. Okay, but what's going to produce the best result? And right. Also that you can get into the weeds with all these things with truth, as they obviously do in this book. But one of the things that I go for, like when I talk about female, I talked about with female gods in Fire in the Dark. It's like, well, what's useful now is like how we're looking at myth to a certain extent. Like, well, there are myths of all different kinds and all different cultures, and they do crazy, weird things and whatever. But what is useful what do I think is going to produce the best result based on all the variables that we see right now? Not like right. What is the really true truth of the thing, but what is like, okay, what's the best story? I guess the best noble lie, but like what's the most helpful story to do the best good with the men that you have at where they're at.
You mentioned noble lie, and I was reminded again of another funny and amusing point of contradiction where in book 6 we're describing the ideal philosophers, the philosopher-kings, and they of course hate lies. They can't stomach lies, but of course, being former guardians or auxiliaries as they're being called now. They were raised on noble lies. So will they, in induction and initiation into the knowledge of how the city is constructed, come to learn that they were raised on lies and yet also with a hatred of lies? How will that work out? You
just told somebody Santa Claus ain't real.
Yeah. Yeah, but maybe even more intensely than that. And there, I'm going to repeat this, like I probably have said it before, and I'll probably continue to say it. But there's basically 2 ways you can read the Republic. Mm-hmm. You can read it as, oh, Plato just didn't see that. That was a sloppy mistake on his part to refute himself. you can believe he's literal and just being sloppy persistently and endlessly contradicting himself, and is producing a literal tract of what knowledge is and what just city is, which is basically if that is true, then Plato's Republic is probably the singular target of my essay in Pater. Which is, I hope you're beginning to see the importance of the math section there too, which is a bit of a tedious slog, but he's talking a lot about geometry here. But the other way to see it is that no, he put that in there intentionally. And we can know he put it there intentionally because there are moments where some of the interlocutors will bring up things that they said before, as in book 5, where he said, we can steel man our opponents, and our opponents will say, we don't need to contradict you. You contradicted yourself when you said each type of person should have their own job and no other, and men and women have different natures. You yourself contradicted. So that's a callback to the end of book 2, beginning book 3. And likewise with this parable of the crew and the ship captain, there's like an echo of Thrasymachus that could be invoked here. Now, Thrasymachus was basically rebutted for speaking sloppily, but he wasn't refuted. No one around them was like, oh yeah, he's definitely wrong and Socrates is definitely right. Everyone is like, that was like, you roped him up, but you didn't persuade us. And so Thrasymachus, after Socrates gives his first sort of rebuttal, has this amusing line, if people who've read this will remember, about how Socrates, do you not know why shepherds raise sheep? It's not for the good of the sheep. It's for so that they can fleece them or eat them, basically. And there is this kind of assumption that is snuck into the metaphor of the boat, that the destination that this boat is going to is in fact a desirable one. And so if that destination is in fact not desirable, if the boat is not actually going to a proper destination, then people, working for a short-term interest in that context actually makes a lot more sense and is the correct decision to make. Now, it is very common in philosophical thought experiments as with mathematics, to say, well, let's assume X. Let's assume Y for the sake of the thought experiment. But the more assumptions that you bring in like that, and it's good to do that explicitly because it keeps them in mind, the more you sneak in, the more divorced from the real world you become. And they become particularly tricky and sneaky when those presumptions are snuck in not explicitly, which is the case with the ship and its destination. And it sounds like a small thing, but it isn't, when we're still trying to figure out what justice is, which we haven't done yet. For a moment, we thought we might have figured it out with, it's the principle of everyone doing their own job. But then more complications have entered the equation, and maybe that's not quite it, especially if the philosopher-king was also supposed to have been a guardian, which is a different job. And, and apparently now he has to study not just the art of governing and having learned about war, but also investigations about truth in a broader sense, perhaps mathematics or geometry, which we get a sort of hint of in book 6 here. But I think we should get to comments here. But your question about sophists versus philosophers reminded me of that there's in the struggle between sophistry and philosophy, and in going deep into philosophy, one of the questions and the problems brought up by Glaucon and Adimantus is philosophy even useful to anybody? And it's a question I've struggled with a little bit, and I think it can be a little overrated. Philosophy can be a little overrated in terms of what it can do. However, one thing that philosophy is very good at is identifying bullshit. and tearing it apart. And sometimes that can be overdone. Sometimes it can sort of take hold of you, and you can find sneaky ways to deconstruct things that are actually strong, even though it's just the other person didn't argue it as clearly and powerfully as they could, which is sort of the theme of book 1 and book 2. But in terms of deconstructing bad arguments that would otherwise sort of hypnotize and enchant and lead a lot of people along, especially maybe in the last 4 years or so, philosophy can be very, very helpful in identifying nonsense, and maybe not bringing you true knowledge, maybe not giving you knowledge of where that boat truly ought to be going, but you can hear someone say, oh, I think the boat should go over here because X, and you can immediately know that's not a good reason.
Right.
So let's backtrack up here. Matthew Seneca says, good evening, gentlemen. Nero happens to come to mind as a great evil white Aurelius would be the first likely example someone may think of. Well, Aurelius would be the first likely example someone. I assume that was in reference to some of our Stoicism comments. We probably should have been addressing these at the time. McTuba says, evening, shot glass, apologies for missing the live last week, lost power. That sucks. Well, I'm glad you have power now. Matthew Seneca helpfully tells me who was speaking the line. It was Adeimantus. I actually caught that, and the second time I mentioned it, I said Adeimantus. Mm-hmm. Bert says, I know we have a couple more of these on the Republic, but if I can request one of these on Hercules in the future, that would be awesome. Cheers anyway, gentlemen. That would be fun.
Yeah.
Hercules.
Yes.
Maybe group Starkadr in there too, for fun. He's kind of a Hercules character.
Yeah. Just Hercules. Then I can go on and on about Superman.
Oh yeah. If you have an interest in Hercules, you really should check out Greg Naj's book, Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours. It's chapter 1, if I remember correctly. We're talking about the meaning of hero and its relation to hora, which is the etymological root we get hour from. And it's of course related to Hera, and talking about all these etymological tie-ins between hero, Hera, Hercules, which is Herakleos, the glory of Hera, which is ironic for a few reasons. His whole life is really just her being mad at Zeus for stepping out. Pretty much, yeah. But something comes of it. So that highly recommend that. If not the whole book, because it's a 600-page slog, at least the first chapter. Very, very worthwhile.
I'm taking Zeus's mindset, as I often do. No, I'm like, how many centuries did you expect me to fuck my sister?
Oh, geez. Matthew Seneca says, the man who must lead is the one who least wants to, but will do it best because he has no ambition in it. Precisely. That's what Plato's Socrates is arguing. McTuba says, with the nothing but absolute respect, F. Tate and all that he presents. I wouldn't say F him and all that he presents. He does provide some valuable tidbits, but it's framed in a way that's maybe not a recipe for a complete life. I feel like Tate's Tate has a lot in common with who's that Christian finance guy that everyone likes? The Gazelle Intensity. He's all about saving and getting out of debt. His name will come to me at some point. But it's like Stoicism. It might be very pragmatic, useful advice for certain kinds of people in certain times of their life.
He's helped a lot of young men make a lot of money. We can say that.
And perhaps you have to make all that money in order to get to the other side and be like, okay, that's not everything.
Right.
Now I have a skill. That's cool. Maybe there's more to life, but going through those phases aren't necessarily mistakes.
Well, in the same subject matter in that, and generally the same realm, there so many guys like there's that pure red pill like manosphere pickup artist vibe, right? And when people look at that, they see like a net bad. They're like, that's kind of gross, and like, what are these dudes doing? Okay,
It is a little bit, but that's okay.
But then what you also have to realize is that for a lot of the guys who consume that content, they do it for a phase.
Yes.
Like they go there and they get what they need to learn out of it. So like they needed to learn a few things about how to talk to women, and a few things that they need to be disabused of, like that old Royce thing, pretty lies. About they need to be corrected about some things that they believe about women that they've been told from their single mom or like whatever.
Yeah.
And then they get to a point where like, well, I can't be in this place where I hate women all the time because I would like to have kids. So like they like transition past that, but they got some value out of that. And I think that probably Tate does the same thing in terms of like, there's a lot of guys who learned how to like make money, get a career or whatever. I mean, I think I know one who probably started out in Tate land and now is just like a guru of that kind of stuff. And he's brilliant.
Yeah.
But he's onto his own thing. He's not like a Tate worshiper now, but like he started there and he moved to their thing. So there's a lot of that happens. I mean, is there a net bad now? I feel like the guy probably leaned a little bit too hard into being a troll. But that's a different thing. And it always feels like gossip when we get into that kind of shit so much.
Yeah. Well, but it's interesting to think about in the context of like sophism versus philosophy too, because there's a middle point. There's a middle character, and that's Aristotle, who we get to, maybe 50 years later. Because Aristotle was a philosopher, was called the philosopher by Thomas Aquinas. Absolutely, he's like a candidate for like maybe smartest person who ever lived. But his, he taught rhetoric as well. He thought it was important to learn rhetoric. And so maybe the best philosopher also knows rhetoric, and perhaps we're seeing that in Plato, where his employment of all these beautiful metaphors, Socrates outclassing Thrasymachus and the little argumentative back and forth with inferior arguments and so forth. Like there's a hint of that, and you can be a sort of man of both worlds, contra the doctrine that we should all have one job and stick to it. And I think, but back to the red pill thing, the most vociferous disgust reactions I've seen to the red pill movement, some of which is justified, but I think the majority of it fails to grasp just how awful the real world, like the regular world, feels to the guys that are attracted to it. They have no empathetic connection to that, and they're like, oh, how can you be attracted to this? It's like, do you have any idea what you are like to these guys? What the world around this in many ways female-centric world that has been created, how completely horrible this is to the majority of men. Really, really great if you're in like the top 5. It's pretty decent for the top 20. Not so great for like the bottom like 60% or so.
No. Yeah.
So
I mean that's why I used to have that they think that they're entitled to marry virgins or whatever. But I mean, that's why you used to have that, because you have to marry off this bottom third of the population, and that was a solution to deal with that. And the same thing with arranged marriages. We need to like hook these people up and get them on a path, because these guys are not the guys who are going to be Don Juaning themselves all over the place. They just need to have a peace at home, and they need to start making a family, and that's what they need to do. And this world is the way the world's set up right now is not really helping these pretty basic dudes do their pretty basic job.
Yeah, and the guy I followed most closely was a guy named Owen Cook, who ran a channel called Real Social Dynamics with like Julian Blanc but like there were women that would show up to them, and I remember listening to some of his videos and be like, I don't think I've ever heard a guy more empathetic to women, understanding the experience of women, than this guy. And the idea that his particular flavor of red pill is like misogynistic, like you'd have to be a feminist to believe that.
Well, the Don Juan type character is closest on the scale really to women and empathizing with women because they like women so much. They want to make the women the centerpiece of their whole world. They want to have women around them all the time. And so like, whereas it's more like the really guys who they would call alpha or whatever, really just don't have time for that. They want to like get drunk, fuck women in a bar, and then go back out with the team.
It's Paris versus Hector.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Matthew Seneca says, I couldn't help but to think that Diogenes might be a philosopher of truth, though I'm not sure honestly. It was a humorous thought nonetheless. Diogenes' famous line is, I'm searching for an honest man. He's in my view, he's kind of a horrible character. He is not just like a nihilist, but kind of a cynic. But that is not necessarily incompatible with being a disciple of the truth. So,
if you believe that everybody sucks, then that's the truth, and you're at the end of the truth, right?
Yeah, this is a weird kind of dragon of sorts.
Yeah.
Matthew Seneca also says he said God, but he didn't say it quite like how we say it. People are strangely good at seeing bad actors on at least that front.
Yeah.
Matthew Seneca also says that reminds me of the Hopi Indian initiation. The men would dress up as the spirits, and the children would believe that they were the spirits. Once they were of age, they were brought into the truth. That's many initiation rituals in like Africa and Southeast Asia have mask initiations of that sort.
Mm-hmm. That's the archetype of initiation, is that you become the ancestors.
Right, precisely.
Is that like whether you're blacking your face out to become like it's something different or whatever, you become someone else, and you become nothing than someone else. Yeah,
a bit of a debate within the order about Chris Kershaw's book and the legitimacy of that. But whether it's good or not, I think the depiction of the Koryos with the black faces. I like to believe it's true, but regardless, it captures something that we see in anthropology and many, many other places as well.
Yeah. It's across the board. I mean, I don't even think I got that from that. I mean, I'm sure it was in there, but I mean, that's why the people that I've been associated with put ash on their faces from that book. But like, generally speaking, there's a lot of becoming the dead is a pretty cross-cultural thing.
I mean, you can kind of see that in Dia de los Muertos a little bit. I'm not super familiar with that, or in the darker side of that, the Santa Muerta stuff. But
or even Halloween.
Yeah, Halloween is a little bit more.
I become a spooky creature. I mean, it's really like a modern version of like I become something scary. Only recently has it become something slutty. But but generally it was like you were supposed to dress up as something scary.
I don't know. There were so my wife and I got this book on the Krampus tradition, which is not like ancient. This is going back to like the 1800s. So it's not like thousands of years old. It's hundreds of years. However, even hundreds of years ago, they had Krampuslavs where a bunch of drunk young men dressed as the Krampus, which is this scary, it's basically an abominable snowman with like goat horns and a demon face. They're running around in the street, on chains, and they've got these switches. And they will, if they find young women, they're switching of the young women, and there's some sort of fertility associated with this. So,
didn't it that's ancient Roman as well.
Lupercalia, yes, Lupercalia.
Yeah.
Isn't that the same time too? Isn't that like February or January, somewhere on there?
Maybe. maybe.
I guess
Definitely, yeah.
yeah. So
Uh,
history rhymes a little bit, it seems.
yeah.
Matthew Seneca says the truth being that their father and uncles and now they are the spirits. Oh, continuing from the Hopi initiation. Yes.
Right. Right.
And finally, he says Nero versus Marcus Aurelius was in reference to how someone who could be a good philosopher with or without good education, one can be great evil or great good. Oh, I see. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. There have been plenty of people who've gotten excellent education and done terrible things. And I mean, that's not exactly the point that Plato's making, but it's sort of an extrapolation from the point he's making about these great natures that if they're, not guided properly, they, do terrible things. The best of souls, if led astray, become the worst people. They become Alcibiades types, right. or a Hitler, or someone terrible.
But I mean, this is also a place where probably Plato overreaches in terms of the power of education, because he's very much of like we need to like program the youth. This if you teach them well, they'll let them lead the way.
Yeah.
I believe that children are the future. But if you do, I mean, that's basically what he's saying, right?
Yeah.
But funny. if you do that, but that's also not true. Like in terms of like if you just educate everyone really, really well, you're still going to have the aberrations and outliers and whatever. And also there's more variables than the education.
Oh, of course. It's funny because
his dad beat the shit out of him, but he got this amazing education. That's something else. Or there was some weird sex thing, or like there's all kinds of like, or like had a traumatic experience, or was just a bad seed. Like a Jeffrey Dahmer kind of like bad seed out of the gate.
That's why he spends so much time talking about not just education but also selection based on the qualities. And he's saying he says it would actually be silly to take someone with an inappropriate nature and give them this education. First of all, they wouldn't even be able to retain it. They wouldn't be able to get through. He has this metaphor of they would fail under it in the way that someone who isn't strong enough might fail under a physical exercise. But also you make a philosopher king out of someone with the improper nature and the whole society will collapse, and education wasn't sufficient to stop them. So he's very much not a blank slatist. He has these, the gold and the silver and the bronze, kinds of people and natures. And the philosopher king role, even the guardian or auxiliary role, is not for everybody in his view. Perhaps it's up to the reader to decide which sort of nature they have or would like to have, because we're going to get more into that in book 10. It comes back to this question of the sort of person you are or want to be, and he's certainly not a blank slatist, but he doesn't seem to be a kind of genetic determinist either. Exactly.
Right.
He does seem to believe that movement is possible. And I think that was one of the most beautiful parts of Michael Segru's depiction of the Republic. For people who have listened to that, or if you haven't, you should, even though I think he gets some things wrong. He describes the way Thrasymachus is the would-be tyrant, and who's Cephalus' son, Polemarchus, is like this sort of democrat, and Adeimantus is this sort of merchant type of like salesman, and Glaucon is this very fiery would-be warrior. But as the dialogue progresses, everyone moves up a level. Thrasymachus, instead of being the would-be tyrant that he is in book 1, asks a democratic question. And I believe it's book 5. He says, I concur. I vote, along with Polemarchus, that we should hear Socrates give this account of the woman. And, so Polemarchus expresses some thoughtfulness of that's moving up from the merely democratic. And Adeimantus, expresses something courageous. He jumps in and stops Socrates. So he's becoming like a warrior, and everyone moves up like just one level. I thought the Michael Segru's interpretation, description of that was very, very poetic and beautiful, and it so perfectly matches the themes that, again, it seems ridiculous. I'm going to unironically appeal to the ridiculous, despite its treatment in Book 5, to think that Plato is putting all of these contradictions and conundrums and paradoxes in here by accident, by sloppiness. Everything in here feels so perfectly structured and amusing in the contradictions. It doesn't seem possible that they were all there just by sloppiness.
Mm-hmm. So I think before we wrap up, as we move towards the end, we should probably talk about forms. Mm-hmm. Because that's an important takeaway. And I've used forms, in the Platonic forms sense for a long time. And I think that in that sense, I'm very Platonic in my approach to things, in terms of thinking, really my work is about the Platonic form of man. All of it really is, what is it as far as essentially this thing, what is this thing beyond a thing that is not really the thing, but is the perfect ideal of the thing. That's the way I perceive it. But why don't you go into a little bit about what they're getting at the forms?
Yeah, well, so it's as with the rest of this book, it can be a little tricky. There is a very well-established school of thought on this front called Neoplatonism, which is pretty well sure of itself in what it believes and so forth. I subscribe to a more Straussian position where maybe we can't be quite so sure about what Plato meant by all this as it looks. But the conventional view of the forms is that the existence of things in the world, what Socrates is calling the many or the diverse, the many beautiful things rather than beauty, are reflections. They are images or shadows of the true thing, which is the idea. And all of these things, and this will become a lot more clear, maybe, hopefully, in Book 7, where we get the allegory of the cave, which is coming up next. But the things in the world, the physical objects that we see in the world, are shadows of the true reality. And the true reality exists in the mind, not our mind, but in mind, in consciousness, in the broadest, most universal sense of that world, that where there exist pure ideas, essentially. And the best way to think about this is, I think, mathematics. I tried to argue in Descending Otis Throne that the number 5 does not exist in the world. The number 5 is a category that we assign to things. But if you have 5 apples, you actually don't have to break it up by the number of fruits. That's a very convenient way of doing it. But what if those fruits weigh slightly differently? What if one of them is a different species? You could divide them, instead of by discrete fruits, you could just divide them by weight. You could divide them by in a variety of other ways, by mass, by color, or whatever the case may be. That 5 is a tool that we've created out of language. But in the world of Platonic forms, in the framework of Platonic forms, 5 doesn't just exist. 5 actually precedes the apples in existence. That's not a very good metaphor, because the number 5 and apples are kind of separate categories. But there would be a perfect idea of an apple. And if you wanted to steelman this, you could think of this as what is the genetic code of an apple? And did not the genetic code of the apple precede the physical apple? Right. It becomes kind of a chicken and egg problem, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I always see it in the perception, and obviously, maybe I'm taking it out of Platonic frame to a certain extent, and making it more practical as to where I actually see reality. But I mean, the Platonic form of an apple is what you draw when you draw an apple. Like, there's an idea of an apple that exists without any particular apple. Like, there's this idea of a thing that you can do without. You don't need the apple present to actually be like. If you ask a kid to draw an apple, they have an idea of what an apple is. Like, that's beyond any particular apple.
So the idea of bringing art into it becomes really funny. If you'll pardon a digression, there's a fun and amusing bit of Christian apologetics called Paley's Watch. And the idea is, a man is walking on the beach and he looks down, and there among the sand is a watch. And he doesn't know who made it. He doesn't know where it came from, but he knows it's not natural like the sand. It clearly looks created by someone. And the Christian says, just as with this watch, we can look at the world and know that it was created by someone. Now, what makes it amusing is we're looking down next to the watch at all the sand, and we're like, the sand is not created, the watch is. Then we step back from the metaphor and it's like, now the sand is created. So, like, which is it? But in the same way, with Plato and the forms, what he is criticizing is images. He's criticizing the indirect, like he says, a true philosopher should be focused on the eternal, the things that are not transient. That's the path of short-term interest and degradation and corruption in the city and maybe in the individual too. So we should be focusing on the true form. When you draw an object, you're creating an image. The image is not the true thing. And so
right.
What would be required
in your mind that is making you draw it is the true thing. That's what
maybe, but maybe your knowledge is also based only on images. And this is why Immanuel Kant landed on the necessity of a priori knowledge. The only true knowledge, true meaning certain, because Socrates says opinion is nothing. Opinion is bad, in fact. We need certainty, or it isn't real knowledge. The only knowledge you can be certain of is knowledge which precedes experience. And that's what leads to the idea of a priori knowledge. Things you can know through reason alone, which is perhaps why Socrates puts reason at the highest level above even knowledge, which is above belief or faith, which is above opinion.
Sounds vaguely crazy. But
it's completely crazy. It's completely crazy.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm like, that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah. No. If you take this, if you take this literally,
right,
then it becomes the singular subject of criticism in my 60-page essay.
Okay.
It's
good. Okay.
Written to criticize.
I mean, there's another thing that I got from a different dialogue from Phaedrus. That it was a line that I thought it really struck me as being very accurate. Something about like when you're attracted to somebody, you're attracted to like a reflection of a thing beyond them. Like, and that's I think extremely accurate to like the way like you're a beautiful thing. Like, but you're really attracted to this beautiful thing that's like beyond them that they're just kind of inhabiting for a second. Like you see a little, you see he says something like you see like a flash of it in them, and that is, I think, a really accurate way to describe how human attraction works, especially like visual attraction, like that kind of like that magic or whatever that people say, like, or when they just see somebody who's hot, whatever. There's some platonic form of hot that you're thinking about that person is kind of like they're kind of like this thing that you think is beautiful. And I think that's very accurate.
It's perfect. Yeah, I need to revisit that because Phaedrus was not my favorite novel of all time
creepy.
is well, I mean it is, but true love of that kind risks coming across as a bit excessive because it's genuine, you know.
Yeah.
My favorite novel of all time is Robert Piercig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Right.
And he was so inspired by Phaedrus that the protagonist is actually named Phaedrus in the story. And it's in pursuit of quality. And is quality this classical thing that we know by reason and clear lines, or is it something we feel? Is it something romantic? And there's a struggle, there's a tension there. And how do we find where quality lies? Sort of in the same way that Plato is pursuing justice in the city, Piercig is pursuing quality in the motorcycle. But it's not about the motorcycle, and he goes all over the place. So more reason to dig into things like Phaedrus, and but yeah, we're beginning to get a glimpse of the forms here, and when it's laid out as Neoplatonists lay it out, it's I would say absurd, and it's driven by a deep need for certainty that is essentially grounded in a desire for civilization, which is very understandable. You know, we need something we can appeal to so that we can resolve our conflicts. And so we need certainty. We need something absolute, something beyond just opinion, which separates men and drives them apart, so that we can work harmoniously together. Unfortunately, that might not be accessible to us. Maybe opinion is all we have. And that doesn't mean that all opinions are equal, you know, far from it. But that shouldn't stop us from appreciating the absolute beauty of the language and some of the metaphors. And there's something to these ideas, even if they seem like ridiculous, at least according to some interpretations of them. There's something truly, perhaps it's a noble lie. Perhaps it's like sophistry that puts us in a mindset that will take us to a better place, even if it isn't quite true, which would be a little ironic in this book. But, you know, that potential for irony doesn't take it out of the domain of possibility.
Right. Cool. All right. Well, that's, I guess that sounds like a bookmark. Because you know you can only meditate so much long on the forms without getting a little crazy. But I wanted to put out there for guys who are listening and will listen later. And also, I'm just a bad person because I haven't put up the audio versions of the last two podcasts yet. But I really need to do that. So my bad. But I kind of, the thing is, I kind of want to drive people to like listen to it on the YouTube, because then we get the views and the likes. Whereas like no one sees how many people like watch it or whatever in a podcast, you know.
Everyone's on Spotify. I'm a bit of a boomer. I listen to things on YouTube. I'll listen to playlists that I create on YouTube. So yeah, everyone's like, my wife's like, just use Spotify like a millennial. I'm like, I should, but I don't.
Yeah. It benefits more for us to have them, you know, see the thing and whatever. Yeah. But so I haven't done that, but I do mean to. But the other thing is that my job for tomorrow is actually I'm going to open up membership to the First Men. So I need to set up the pipeline to be able to make that happen. Set up the application and get out the newsletter and all that stuff to make that happen. That's my day for tomorrow, is to get that rolling, because I feel like we're at a really good place right now. I wanted to get us to a really good place before I did it, because I felt like there was some stuff with the First Men that weren't working. But as I think we've mentioned before, I just changed some features on our chat. It was amazing, the difference. It's like old times, like all the guys from all the different places are talking and like sharing information, and half of it's, well, today half of it was dick jokes, and then the other half of it, it's like dick jokes peppered with like really serious conversations like in between. Yeah. And then you never know
what you're gonna get. It's gonna be either like like Jeremy putting just the most badass paint jobs you've ever seen in your entire life, or dick jokes, or like serious nerding out on some indic shit that like you've never heard before.
Yeah, we were going down a rabbit hole about the Agni stuff, and like going to me asking Ed questions is in there too. So it's like you, and that's what we kind of fixed, is that before that was all like one like fire hose of information that was out of control, and so I killed it because it was out of control. But now whatever Telegram is what we use in the First Men, and it's broken out into folders. And now all of a sudden that's all working because the firearms guys are talking about firearms in the firearms folder, and it's not in the myth folder, and it's not in the mainstream dick joke folder. So like, there's all kinds of things going on. Different conversations are able to happen, and we're going to probably expand that further. We just, I'm creating new folders for every time that people want to keep something alive, like a discussion going. So that's the First Man has been working out really well lately. Everything has been really positive. And so if you are in the Discord group, I did an AMA and some people asked some questions, and I did some introductions, and I'll do a little bit more of that tomorrow. But we're looking to get some guys into the First Men and get them started with their challenges and everything, and then move forward.
Awesome.
I think that's going to be. And like I said, we're at a good point. That's what I wanted. I want us to be the things to be rolling, and things are rolling right now. So it's a good point, good time to join the First Men. So I'll put that out. If you're on the newsletter mailing list, that's where I'm going to hit tomorrow, probably, with everything, because that's the point of it. So we'll start that tomorrow, and then we'll see what we get.
Before we go, Matthew Seneca, excellent comments. He's just saying something about Shintoism, which I don't know if we have time to get to, but he had this one comment. He says, is that similar to how fruit is the idea, but strawberry and blueberry, while they are fruit, aren't fruit in its fullness, or better yet, cat as idea reflected as house cats and lions? And I think this is where you get into a funny kind of conundrum with the forms. Is cat one form, or are lions and tabbies separate forms? Are there separate forms for that? And would there be a separate form for not just each species, but each individual, with the highest, most perfect form of that individual, the correct idea of that individual? And would that form even be the same form that would exist from moment to moment? Or would a different emanation of perfection exist for each moment and context that that individual might live in?
Like basically the multiverse is what.
Yeah, or an infinite regress of like, and then you get to the questions like, well, what's the relationship between forms and language, which was sort of my route in challenging it. And then you're like, oh, look, if these are just linguistic constructs, then none of this makes any sense at all. And like all of coherence theory of truth falls apart, which is sort of where I tried to go. But yeah, the question about cats was a funny one. I thought worth commenting on.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, it'd be weird. I like the idea of like perfect version of yourself in another world where I'm a sociopath and I run scams. Like I could become a therapist that like helps you reveal the platonic form of yourself, of what you were destined to be.
Your highest self. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I could
the
tap
language
into
is there for it.
I can enter the realm of the forms and see it.
guide them to the sun out of the cave.
Yes. I put on my virtual reality goggles, and I'm going to go into the world of the forms.
Oh no, you're running into another cave there, because if you put on the virtual reality goggles, you're leaving the cave and you're going into the matrix. So that's true.
That's true.
You
but
can't escape.
You can do this any way that you want, because then you can be like, but the magic is in the AI, and the AI is bringing us the forms, and like it's how you can do anything with it, because once you go down that rabbit hole of like snake oil sales, you can just turn it upside down and make it crazy. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Make it wild.
That's what makes me, for all my years in philosophy, sometimes just doing electrical work. It's
that's the thing.
Doing it this way.
I almost brought
the
you
metal
up
is
on
metal, the copper is copper.
Yeah, I almost brought you up on X yesterday because I think Ajax was going on a rant because it's a conservative thing. Like conservatives are like, get in the trades, and he's like, well, that's not how you change civilizations. That's and whatever. I was like, well, it's my point, which I didn't even make the comment because I was like, I don't need to get into this, but I was like, no, there. I mean, if you're not a few guys, it's like, well, for regular guys, that's the most responsible advice I can give them. Like, I'm not going to send them in the military. I'm not going to send them, like, most guys are not sneaky enough to navigate the HR world of corporate stuff. And, and what are they going to do that's satisfying where they make a decent amount of money? Well, it's a good, and get around the HR stuff as much as they possibly can.
Yeah,
it's a good, it's a good route for a lot of guys.
Well, two thoughts come to my mind. First of all, like, through what other job could you save civilization? Really?
Well, he's talking about exactly what the left did, which is march through the institutions.
Oh, okay. Well,
like, you actually go and take control of the actual institutions, and that's how you do the thing.
I suppose. But I mean, I've been in places. I worked at Microsoft for a little while, and that's a pretty left-wing place. It felt very civilized. Everything was extremely nice in Redmond, Washington. If anyone's visited there, it is a very nice place. Very left-wing. It's very civilized. I think our experience of civilization comes down to things working. A lot of the time, it's like it's indoor plumbing. It's in many ways it's the things the trades provide. Now, the higher end stuff of that, the higher end of the logistics is a lot of computer work in making sure trucks and large shipments get to where they need to go. But yeah, it's a lot of boring and mundane stuff. It's running power from this place, it's running water from that place, it's running the materials needed to construct this, that, the other thing, getting silicon chips manufactured properly. It's a lot of mundane stuff that needs to get done. But that's what the experience of civilization is like. Saving civilization is largely just making nice things. And the way the left is destroying it is, I mean, it is and it isn't bad ideas. If you want to say it's bad ideas, then like that would be like the Platonic arguments, like the ideas precede the thing. But a lot of it is people just, they don't want to make nice things. They use stuff, they use tricky rhetoric to take things that aren't theirs, and they don't make anything nice, and they break shit.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's in anyone's power to save civilization. A lot of that depends on how you define civilization. What is
I mean, that could be a straw man anyway. Civilization is one thing, and they're really talking about like the West or whatever. Like that becomes a different thing.
Same thing. Yeah, what is justice that we're trying to become?
You have to define what your terms are trying to save. But I think also if we step out of Nerdland, we know what they're trying to save. The majority of the people that he's talking about, not necessarily like all the subgroups because they have their own version of the thing, but it's like, they're trying to save, like some of the basic foundational things,
rule of law, or whatever.
Well, that, yeah.
But again, like there's an ambiguous Plato answer, I suppose, but there's a much less ambiguous. Since we mentioned Robert Pirsig before, there's a much less ambiguous Robert Pirsig answer. And it was one of my favorite lines of the book, where he's talking about people studying different things, and he talks about there are all these people out there who are trying to save the world. I'm just trying to fix a motorcycle, and sort of like we'll see which of those approaches does more good in the long run. And I think very often it's actually the guy who's just trying to fix the motorcycle, and not to sound too much like the individual tradesman, everyone doing their own job from book 3, but there's a tremendous amount of harm that comes from people who are too young and naive, without experience in the world, who think they're going to save it without understanding what it is they're trying to save. And that's predominantly leftists. It's predominantly leftists right now. They took some model UN classes, got a God complex, go to some Ivy League school, and are convinced they're going to save Africa from like some population explosion or whatever the fuck they think is a problem, with no experience in the matter, no understanding of what they're messing with. But the potential is there on the right as well. Oh, we're going to save Western civilization, but we need to take these dramatic steps in order to save Western civilization. It's like, do you now? Do you have any vested interest? Will you pay any cost if you're wrong? You know, and like when you look at the complexity, the decentralized nature of what it is we're referring to when we talk about civilization, it often just comes down to nice things. It comes down to quality, to good stories, good experiences, nice roads, freaking electricity that turns on. Like, that's what makes a second world country. You can't get the medicine you need. The roads are shit. The food will give you food poisoning, 3 times out of 10. You don't have indoor plumbing reliably. A lot of it is actually much more closely related to the trades than it is to all of these great ideas, which often attract people who are already in agreement with ideas than it is necessarily educating people in things that they didn't necessarily know already, depending on what the education is in, of course.
Right. I mean, all that aside, I mean, I was just, like in the comments they were talking about, there was a lot of deprecation of the trades or whatever. And I was like,
they're lost.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. You have to live in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of morons and a lot of, and I was like, that's not true. But none of that's true. I mean, I was just reading it. I'm like, this is foolishness. But the thing that they're missing that does come with the trades or just a certain kind of work is a certain amount of satisfaction. And I've been thinking about that lately. And to be the managerial class, you don't actually do anything. Your job is hiring people to do things and so if you actually enjoy doing anything and actually starting a project and finishing it, or actually doing good work along the way, it's a different thing. And the idea that the satisfaction that you get from that is different. And the other day, Kyle in a group post, he was building a barn, and I'm like, that seems really satisfying. I'm just looking at him building a barn out in the middle of nowhere. And I remember building stuff out of Volgang or whatever. I'm talking about, I'm just my day is about Simpson ties or whatever. That sounds great. I'm trying to figure out this stuff, how to make certain things run and other shit. And what am I supposed to say to people to guide them in their lives? And building a barn sounds nice.
Immensely gratifying. And you get this experience at least as an electrician. I can't speak for plumbers, but I imagine carpenters feel something similar. You're driving downtown with your family, and you're like, that big 6-story building there, we put the lights in that. We like that sign. We put the lights on that. So I've only done one billboard, but it sucked.
But that's me listening to my dad my entire time growing up.
Yeah.
You're driving around what those transformers do up there is no one cares. He's I mean, some more useless information you don't need to know, but he's fascinated by it, and he's done the work and been around that thing, and
he's got
put some of that stuff in over there.
He's got a sense of ownership of his city, and it's a wonderful feeling. I mean, that's the reason why I quit Microsoft. The money was nice. The money was pretty decent, actually, but But you can only sit behind an Excel spreadsheet for so long if you are a certain kind of person before you feel like this money feels stolen. It's not. They'd love to give it to you, but it is this empty, what Matthew Crawford calls the most ghostly kinds of work. You're just moving numbers around on a screen, and it doesn't feel like anything. And the example I had mentioned before we even started the show that Plato brought up in book 6, and I said we would get to, and then we almost didn't, was the depiction of the man with a philosophical nature who perceives the uselessness of philosophy to save things, to save his civilization. And so, but he doesn't want to become mean. He doesn't want to become a sophist and to become corrupt in that way. So he, like a man perceiving a blizzard who takes, refuge behind a wall, if I remember correctly, he seeks to at least save himself. And if Socrates says, this is good, it's not the greatest good, it is good, but it's there's something even better if you can save the world and stuff too, or your city. Maybe, if you think you can do that. But when we get to book 10 at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about private men, and the goal in the concluding paragraph doesn't seem to be about saving the city, but about saving yourself and about finding salvation for your own soul, and which as a concluding bracket for the whole story sort of reminds us of the bracket we're operating within, where the city is still the individual, or the enlarged sign on the hill we're looking at in order to find justice for the individual.
Nice. Cool. All right, do we have any more comments, or is that it?
Matthew Seneca says, like the ending of the movie Interstellar, I can enter the Tesseract of Forms. Yes,
Tesseract of Forms. That's yes. We'll just rewrite it as Tesseract of Forms. It'll actually sell better than the Republic.
It doesn't take much.
Yeah, it'll sound sci-fi, but cool. All right, well, guys, as always, thanks for participating and watching along, and those who are watching later. I hope so. We have some guys reading along, and I hope you're getting something out of the Republic. But and we talked already today that we're going to have to come up with some spicy stuff. Although Hercules has been thrown out there.
That's a good one.
Sounds
that's
like a lot
suggestion.
of fun. It is a good one.
Yeah.
I think that's on the menu. We can't forget about that. But yeah, we're gonna have to do that, and then something spicy to get everybody's attention back after they've been like, you just did 10 weeks of Republic. But anyway,
Palestine,
thanks guys.
JQ.
And
sorry.
No. But anyway, guys, thanks for everything, but not too spicy. That's a spicy meatball. We don't know. No. Do a spicy meatball. But anyway,